Bullies stuck a banana in his locker. He shoved one down their throats later. The morning light filtered through the tall windows of Westbridge High School's main hallway, casting long shadows across the polished linoleum floors that still smelled faintly of industrial cleaner. Students moved in clusters, their voices echoing off metal lockers in that particular rhythm of pre-class chaos that felt both familiar and alienating. Owen Mitchell stood at locker 217, methodically arranging his textbooks in the order he'd need them throughout the day, a habit he'd developed to avoid unnecessary trips back. He was the kind of presence that barely registered in peripheral vision, slight-framed with hunched shoulders that seemed to apologize for occupying space, dark hair that fell across his forehead in a way that let him hide behind it when necessary. His clothes hung loose on his frame, always a size too big, always in muted colors that helped him blend into backgrounds. The bruise on his left shoulder from 2 days ago had faded to a yellowish green, hidden beneath his gray hoodie. Westbridge High sat on the eastern edge of Millerton, a mid-sized town in upstate New York where everyone knew everyone else's business, where the local diner still had a jukebox that played songs from the 80s, where Friday night football games were the social event of the week. The school itself was a sprawling brick structure built in the 70s, with additions tacked on over the decades that gave it a maze-like quality. The main building connected to the gymnasium through a covered walkway, and the cafeteria occupied what had once been a separate auditorium space, its high ceilings creating acoustics that amplified every conversation into a wall of noise. Behind the school, the football field stretched out in manicured green, bordered by metal bleachers that rattled in the wind, and beyond that, the student parking lot where the social hierarchy was displayed through vehicle quality and parking spot proximity to the building. Owen had moved to Millerton 6 months ago with his mother after his father's third deployment turned into something nobody talked about in specific terms. His mother worked double shifts at the regional hospital, her exhaustion visible in the permanent shadows under her eyes, her smile still warm but requiring visible effort. They lived in a small rental house on Maple Street, the kind with thin walls and a front porch that sagged slightly on one side, surrounded by chain-link fence that needed painting. Inside, photographs of his father in uniform watched from the mantel, frozen in moments of pride and purpose that felt impossibly distant. Owen remembered his father's hands, rough and capable, teaching him things in the garage of their old house, the scent of motor oil and metal filings, the patient way he'd explain leverage and balance, and the physics of force. He remembered other lessons too, delivered in the backyard with the setting sun casting their shadows long across the grass, his father's voice calm and measured as he demonstrated movements that flowed like water, rooted like trees. At Westbridge High, Owen had tried to be invisible, tried to simply get through each day and return home to the quiet of his room where he could lose himself in mechanical engineering diagrams or old martial arts manuals his father had left behind. But invisibility, he'd learned, was not actually an option. Some people seemed to have radar for weakness, or what they perceived as weakness, and they circled it like sharks scenting blood in water. Tyler Brennan noticed everything that could be exploited, and Owen had registered on his radar from day one. Tyler was the kind of presence that filled a room without trying, tall and broad-shouldered from his position as starting linebacker on the football team, with that particular brand of confidence that came from never having been seriously challenged. His face had the square-jawed handsomeness that made teachers give him the benefit of the doubt, made girls glance twice in the hallways, made other students defer without conscious thought. He moved through Westbridge High like he owned it, flanked by his constant companions. Derek Sanderson, wiry and mean, with a smile that never reached his eyes, always the first to laugh at someone else's misfortune. Marcus Cho, whose parents owned the largest car dealership in 3 counties, using his family's money and his own cruel creativity to torment anyone he deemed beneath his status. And Brett Collins, a hulking presence who spoke little but whose size alone created intimidation, content to follow Tyler's lead and provide the muscle when intimidation needed physical emphasis. The first incident had been almost casual, a shoulder check in the hallway that sent Owen's books scattering across the floor while Tyler kept walking without looking back, his laughter echoing off the lockers. Then the tripped foot in the cafeteria that sent Owen's lunch tray flying, spaghetti sauce painting an arc across the industrial tile, while 200 students turned to watch, some laughing, most simply relieved it wasn't them. The names came next, delivered in passing, but always loud enough for others to hear, each one carefully chosen to maximize humiliation with minimum effort. Owen endured it with downcast eyes and clenched jaw, picking up his books, cleaning up his lunch, responding to the names with silence that only seemed to encourage more creativity in the attacks. The cafeteria at lunch was a study in social stratification. The football players claimed the tables nearest the windows, their territory marked by letterman jackets draped over chairs and the particular volume of their conversations. The popular crowd clustered nearby, cheerleaders and student council members, and anyone who'd successfully navigated the complex social calculus of high school hierarchy. Further out, the various tribes staked their claims. Band kids, theater students, academic overachievers, skaters, and various other groups defined by shared interests or mutual protection. At the far edges, near the emergency exit that was always propped open to combat the cafeteria's perpetual stuffiness, the invisible kids sat in ones and twos, grateful to be beneath notice. Owen usually claimed a corner spot at one of these far tables, his back to the wall, where he could eat quickly and leave without drawing attention. But even there, Tyler's crew found him. They had a talent for making harassment look accidental, for delivering humiliation in ways that left no clear evidence, nothing a teacher could definitively point to as bullying. A shove that looked like someone stumbling, a drink accidentally spilled, a chair pulled away just as someone sat down, and always the laughter, that particular sound of cruelty masquerading as humor. On a Tuesday in October, 3 weeks into the school year, Owen opened his locker to find a banana, bruised and browning, stuffed between his textbooks with enough force that it had burst, leaving sticky residue across his chemistry notes. The smell hit him first, overripe and sickly sweet, and then the sight of the damage, months of careful notes now ruined. Around him, students passing in the hallway slowed their steps, watching his reaction with that mixture of sympathy and relief that characterized most bystander behavior. Tyler stood 15 feet away, leaning against his own locker with Derek, both of them making no effort to hide their amusement. "Guess someone left you a snack, Mitchell," Tyler called out, his voice carrying easily over the hallway noise. "Thought you might be hungry. You look like you could use the protein." Derek's laugh was sharp and theatrical. "Maybe he should eat it. Waste not, want not, right?" Owen said nothing, carefully extracting the ruined banana and wiping out his locker with paper towels from his backpack, his movements methodical and controlled, while his face burned and his hands wanted to shake but didn't because he wouldn't give them that satisfaction. He felt the weight of watching eyes, the judgment of silence, the complicity of those who saw but did nothing. When his locker was as clean as he could make it, he gathered his books and walked away, feeling Tyler's laughter following him down the hallway like a physical presence. In second-period English literature, Mrs. Patterson droned on about symbolism in Lord of the Flies, while Owen sat in his usual back corner seat, ostensibly taking notes, but actually thinking about leverage points and striking angles, about the way his father had taught him that real strength wasn't about size or aggression, but about understanding physics and timing and the channeling of force. He thought about the footwork drills they'd practiced in the backyard, The way his father had emphasized balance and centeredness over speed or power, the philosophy behind movements that looked deceptively simple but contained layers of complexity. Owen's father had trained in Okinawan karate for 20 years before military service took him to other places. Learned from an old master in a strip mall dojo that taught traditional methods to anyone patient enough to learn them properly. The lessons had been about more than fighting, about discipline and respect, and the responsibility that came with capability. His father had made him promise, before that last deployment, to only use what he'd learned in true necessity, to walk away from pride-based conflicts, to understand that real courage was often found in restraint rather than action. So Owen walked away. Day after day, incident after incident, he walked away. When Brett shoved him into a locker hard enough to leave a bruise on his spine, Owen walked away. When Marcus accidentally knocked his tray in the lunch line, sending his food splashing across his shirt, Owen walked away to the bathroom to clean up as best he could, wearing the stains for the rest of the day like a badge of shame. When Derek tripped him on the stairs and his books went tumbling down half a flight while students stepped around him like he was furniture, Owen picked up his books and walked away. The promise to his father felt like a chain around his chest, getting tighter with each swallowed insult, each ignored provocation. His mother noticed the changes in him, the way he'd gone quieter than usual, the way he sometimes came home with torn clothes or new bruises he'd explain away with vague stories about gym class accidents or his own clumsiness. She worked such long hours that her opportunities to ask questions were limited, and when she did, Owen deflected with enough skill that her exhaustion usually won out over her concern. He couldn't add his problems to her burdens, not when she was already carrying so much, not when he could see the weight of his father's absence in every line of her face, hear it in the way she paused before saying anything about the future, as if even planning ahead was an act of faith she couldn't quite manage. The school itself seemed designed to enable this kind of low-level violence. Teachers who didn't want to see, who interpreted clear harassment as boys being boys, or typical teenage drama, who suggested victims should toughen up or learn to take a joke. Mr. Hendricks, the vice principal responsible for discipline, was a former football coach who still saw the world through that lens, who gave athletes the benefit of every doubt and viewed academic kids as soft. When Owen had tried once to report the ongoing harassment, Hendricks had asked what he'd done to provoke it, suggested he was being oversensitive, implied that learning to stand up for himself was part of becoming a man. The message was clear. You're on your own, and complaining makes you weak. October bled into November, and the harassment continued its steady drumbeat. In the gym during mandatory physical education, Coach Morrison divided students into teams for basketball, and Tyler made sure Owen was always picked last. Made sure he was always guarded by Brett, whose physical presence turned every play into barely disguised assault under the cover of sport. In the hallways between classes, the shoulder checks and shoves became routine, Owen's body developing a roadmap of bruises in various stages of healing, purple and blue and yellow-green, a timeline written on his skin. In the parking lot after school, Tyler's crew would sometimes block Owen's path on his walk home, forcing him to detour around them while they called out suggestions about where trash should walk, laughing at their own creativity. The student body mostly watched with that particular cowardice that comes from relief at not being the target. A few showed sympathy in private. Small kindnesses like helping pick up dropped books when no one was watching, but public support was too costly in the ecosystem of high school social survival. Owen understood their logic even as he felt the isolation of it, understood that martyring yourself for someone else's cause was a big ask when you were just trying to get through each day yourself. There was one exception, though she didn't know it yet. Jenna Reyes sat 2 seats ahead of Owen in English literature, and sometimes in the library during study periods, and occasionally at one of the middle-distance cafeteria tables with a small group of friends who seemed to exist in that safe middle ground of not quite popular but not vulnerable either. She had dark hair she wore in a perpetual ponytail, expressive brown eyes that actually seemed to see things rather than just look at them, and a tendency to wear vintage band t-shirts that suggested musical taste beyond the mainstream. Owen had noticed her the way someone notices sunlight through clouds, a brief warmth in otherwise grey days. But he'd been careful not to let that notice become anything visible. Attention of any kind felt dangerous now, and besides, what did he have to offer anyone? He was the designated victim, the school punching bag, and association with him carried social costs no one should have to pay. But Jenna noticed him anyway, or started to. He caught her looking sometimes in English class, her expression thoughtful rather than pitying, and once in the library when Tyler's crew surrounded his table with their loud presence and calculated menace until he gathered his books and left. He'd seen her watching with something that might have been anger tightening her jaw. She'd never approached him directly, never spoken to him beyond the casual classroom interactions that meant nothing, but there was an awareness there that made Owen more conscious of his own carefully maintained invisibility. The breaking point came on a Wednesday morning in mid-November, when the weather had turned cold enough that everyone's breath made clouds in the parking lot and the grass crunched underfoot with morning frost. Owen arrived at school early as usual, before the main crowds, and made his way to his locker through hallways that echoed with emptiness. He spun the combination lock, pulled open the door, and froze. They'd outdone themselves this time. His locker had been filled, absolutely packed, with garbage. Crumpled papers, food wrappers, half-eaten sandwiches, a milk carton leaking something sour, and dozens of banana peels, positioned carefully to create maximum visual impact. The smell hit him like a physical force, rotten and overwhelming. Taped to the inside of the locker door was a note in thick marker. "This is where trash belongs." Owen stood there, staring at the destruction of his personal space, feeling something crack inside his chest. It wasn't the garbage itself, though that was humiliating enough. It wasn't even the note, though its message landed with precision. It was the realization that this would never end, that walking away only taught them they could escalate without consequence, that his father's wisdom about choosing battles had been built on the assumption that antagonists had some limit to their cruelty. These people had no limit. They would keep pushing until they broke something irreparable, and he was tired of being the thing that bent under pressure. Students started arriving, the hallways filling with voices and footsteps and locker slams, and Owen felt their attention focusing on him like heat from a magnifying glass. The whispers started, spreading outward in concentric circles of gossip and speculation. Tyler and his crew arrived fashionably late, their timing suggesting they'd been waiting for an audience. They made no effort to hide their satisfaction, standing close enough that Owen could hear their commentary about how appropriate the display was, how fitting for someone of his status. "Looks like someone's been decorated," Tyler said, his voice loud enough to carry. "Very authentic. Really captures the essence." Derek was already pulling out his phone, angling for photos that would no doubt end up on social media within minutes. "This is art, man. This is making a statement." Owen closed his locker carefully, the garbage still inside, and turned to face them. He didn't say anything, didn't respond to their provocations, but something in his eyes must have registered, because Tyler's smile faltered for just a second before reasserting itself with more aggression. "You got something to say, Mitchell?" "No?" Smart choice. "Know your place." Owen walked away, as he'd walked away 100 times before, but this time felt different. This time felt final. Something had shifted in the architecture of his patience. Some load-bearing wall had developed a crack, and he knew with absolute certainty that the next incident, whatever it was, would exceed his capacity to absorb it. The promise to his father was important, sacred even, but there were things that mattered more than promises made in different circumstances to different versions of himself. His father would understand that, wouldn't he? His father, who'd gone to war when necessity demanded it, who'd taught him that true strength included knowing when to act, not just when to restrain. In the cafeteria at lunch, Owen sat at his usual corner table and watched the social choreography of the room with new eyes. He watched Tyler hold court at the center of everything, watch students angle for his attention or carefully avoid his gaze, depending on their status. Watch the machinery of dominance and submission play out in hundreds of small interactions. He watched Jenna Reyes at her middle-distance table, laughing with her friends, but occasionally glancing toward Tyler's group with an expression Owen couldn't quite read. He watched teachers on cafeteria duty deliberately not see the harassment happening 10 feet from where they stood, their willful blindness a form of enablement that made them complicit. And he made a decision. Not about fighting back, not exactly, but about preparation. If the promise to his father required him to walk away until true necessity arose, then he needed to be ready for when that necessity came. He needed to remember everything he'd been taught, needed to practice it again, needed to rebuild the skills that had atrophied in months of deliberate avoidance. He would keep walking away, but when walking away was no longer possible, when they left him no other choice, he would not be defenseless. The thought should have felt like giving up on something, but instead it felt like the first deep breath after being underwater too long. That afternoon after school, Owen walked home through the cold November air, taking the long route that avoided the parking lot and the possibility of another encounter. Millerton looked different in the fading afternoon light, the familiar houses and shops taking on an unfamiliar quality, as if he was seeing them clearly for the first time. The diner on Main Street advertised their Thanksgiving special on a handwritten sign. The hardware store had Christmas decorations already displayed in the window. The library sat quiet and dignified on its corner lot, like an anchor point of civilization. Life was happening all around him, normal and peaceful, while at school he existed in a different reality, governed by different rules. At home, the house was empty as usual, his mother still hours away from the end of her shift. Owen dropped his backpack in the hallway and stood for a moment in the living room, looking at his father's photographs on the mantel, at the flag folded in its triangular case, at the letters that arrived sometimes in his father's handwriting from whatever classified location he currently occupied. He thought about calling him, about explaining the situation. But what could his father do from wherever he was? What advice could he give beyond what he'd already given? The lessons were there, in Owen's muscle memory and mental catalogue of techniques, waiting to be accessed. He just needed to practice, to remember, to prepare. In the backyard, brown grass crunched under his feet as Owen began moving through forms he hadn't practiced in months, his body remembering the sequences even as his muscles protested the unfamiliar demands. The forms felt awkward at first, his balance off, his movements lacking the fluid precision they'd once had. But as he continued, as the cold air burned in his lungs and his legs began to shake with effort, something started to come back. The sense of centeredness, of gathering force rather than expending it wastefully, of moving with intention rather than reaction. His father's voice echoed in his memory, patient corrections and philosophical observations about the nature of conflict and resolution. Real fighting isn't about anger, his father had said during one of their last training sessions. It's about clarity. When you're angry, you're predictable. When you're clear, you're dangerous. Owen practiced until darkness fell and his mother's car pulled into the driveway, then helped her carry groceries inside and listened to her stories about hospital politics and difficult patients while they prepared a simple dinner together. She was too tired to notice the new quality in his silence, or if she noticed, she was too tired to investigate. They ate pasta with jarred sauce and talked about nothing important, and Owen felt the strange disconnection of living in two separate worlds simultaneously. The normal one, where you ate dinner with your mother and worried about homework, and the shadow one, where you were preparing for violence you hoped wouldn't come, but suspected was inevitable. November deepened toward December, and Owen split his time between endurance at school and preparation at home. The harassment continued its steady rhythm, the garbage incident having set a new baseline that Tyler's crew worked to maintain or exceed. They moved his gym clothes while he was in the shower, forcing him to wear his sweaty practice uniform for the rest of the day. They spread rumors about him that ranged from ridiculous to vicious, each one designed to further isolate him socially. They made monkey noises when he walked past, a racist attack that made no sense given Owen's white suburban background, but apparently humor wasn't their strong suit. What mattered to them was the power dynamic, the daily reinforcement of their dominance and his subordination, the way they could shape his experience of school through their choices and their cruelty. But something was changing in Owen, a subtle shift that hadn't yet manifested visibly but was building like water behind a dam. His practice sessions in the backyard became longer, more intense, conducted in cold and dark, that made them harder but also more focused. He reviewed the philosophy alongside the technique, reading his father's old martial arts books and thinking about concepts like distance management, conflict de-escalation, and the difference between reactive and responsive action. He worked on his conditioning, the stamina that would be necessary if a confrontation lasted more than a few seconds, the core strength that anchored every technique, the flexibility that allowed movement without telegraphing intention. In school, he began to notice things differently. The way Tyler and his crew moved, their patterns and habits, and the tells that preceded their attacks. The physical space of the building, the sight lines and bottlenecks and places where intervention would be unlikely. The timing of teacher rotations and the gaps in surveillance. The social dynamics that made some witnesses more likely to support one side or another. He wasn't planning violence, but he was mapping the terrain of possibility, understanding the environment in a way he hadn't bothered to before, when all his energy went into simply surviving each day. Jenna Reyes spoke to him for the first time on a Monday in early December, approaching his library table during a study period with a directness that surprised him. She set her books down across from him without asking permission and met his startled gaze with steady brown eyes. "The thing with your locker," she said quietly, her voice low enough that only he could hear. "That was beyond messed up. I'm sorry that happened to you. Nobody should have to deal with that." Owen stared at her, unsure how to respond. Sympathy was rare enough to feel suspicious, and public association with him seemed like a choice she'd regret. "It's fine," he said finally, the automatic deflection that had become his default response to everything. "It's clearly not fine," Jenna said, and there was something in her tone that suggested she wasn't going to accept his dismissal. "And before you warn me off, or whatever you're thinking, I'm not scared of Tyler Brennan and his idiot friends. My cousin's on the team, and I grew up around those guys. They're not half as intimidating as they think they are." "You don't know what they're capable of," Owen said, and realized as he said it that it was true, that their capacity for casual cruelty had surprised him repeatedly, that underestimating them was a mistake he'd made initially and wouldn't make again. "Maybe not," Jenna conceded, "but I know what I'm capable of, and that includes deciding who I want to talk to without asking permission from some linebacker who peaked in 11th grade." She pulled out her homework and started working, as if the conversation was over, and her presence at his table was now simply established fact. Owen tried to focus on his own work, but her presence created a distraction that had nothing to do with noise or movement. He was acutely aware of her across the table, the way she chewed her pen while thinking, the way her handwriting sprawled across the page in enthusiastic loops, the faint scent of whatever shampoo or perfume she used that made him think of summer, despite the December cold outside. When the study period ended, and they gathered their books. She smiled at him briefly, a real smile that reached her eyes, and walked away before he could figure out what to say. The next day, she sat at his cafeteria table without asking, her lunch tray clattering down across from him, while her friends watched from their usual spot, with expressions of confusion and concern. Tyler's table noticed too, the volume of their conversation dropping slightly as they processed this development, and Owen felt his stomach tighten with the certainty that this wouldn't end well. "You really shouldn't," he said to Jenna, keeping his voice low. "Shouldn't what?" "Sit where I want." She bit into her sandwich with deliberate casualness. "This is America, Mitchell. Freedom of assembly and all that. You know what I mean." "I do," she said, her expression more serious now. "And I'm telling you, I don't care. I'm tired of watching people get pushed around while everyone else pretends not to notice. If me sitting here bothers Tyler so much, he can come say it to my face." Owen wanted to tell her that it wouldn't be Tyler who paid the price, that she was volunteering for collateral damage in a conflict that wasn't hers, but there was something in her determined jaw and steady gaze that suggested arguing would be pointless. So they ate lunch together, while the cafeteria buzzed with speculation, and Owen felt the weight of attention like physical pressure against his skin. The retaliation came 2 days later, swift and creative as always. Someone, almost certainly Derek based on the artistic flourishes, created a fake social media account using Owen's name and posted a series of increasingly desperate messages professing love and obsession directed at Jenna. The messages were crafted to be just believable enough to cause damage, while being obviously fake enough to avoid serious consequences, and they spread through the school's social network with the viral efficiency of truly humiliating content. By the end of the school day, Owen's phone buzzed with screenshots people kept sending him, each one like a small detonation of shame. Jenna found him in the hallway after last period, her face flushed with anger. "I know you didn't write those," she said immediately. "Everyone with half a brain knows you didn't write those." "But not everyone has half a brain," Owen said, his voice flat. "This is why you shouldn't have sat with me." "No," Jenna said firmly. "This is why Tyler and his friends are garbage human beings. Don't you dare make their choices your fault." But it was his fault, in a way. His existence, his weakness, his inability to fight back effectively, created the vacuum they filled with their cruelty. If he was stronger or braver or different somehow, none of this would be happening. Jenna would be safe in her middle-distance social position, and he would be, what? Still being harassed, just without the added guilt of dragging others down with him. That night in his backyard, Owen practiced with an intensity that bordered on violence, his movements sharp and precise, his breathing controlled despite the burning in his muscles. He imagined opponents, multiple attackers coming from different angles, and worked through the defensive patterns his father had taught him for exactly those scenarios. Circle rather than retreat. Redirect rather than absorb. Use their momentum against them. Find the line between defense and offense and walk it with absolute precision. When he finally stopped, his t-shirt was soaked with sweat despite the December cold, and his hands were shaking with exhaustion. His mother called him in for dinner, and he showered and changed and sat at the table and pretended to be fine, while inside he felt like a pressure cooker approaching maximum capacity. The fake social media account was just the beginning. Over the next week, Tyler's crew escalated in ways that showed real creativity and dedication to their craft. They stole Owen's gym clothes and left him notes about where he could find them, sending him on scavenger hunts through increasingly humiliating locations. They started a rumor that he'd been caught doing something inappropriate in the bathroom, vague enough to avoid direct accusation, but specific enough to make everyone uncomfortable around him. They created a game where points were awarded for making him flinch or drop things, turning his existence into literal sport. And they started targeting Jenna too, subtle at first, but increasingly direct. Comments about her taste in friends, speculation about why she'd associate with losers, suggestions that maybe she wasn't as attractive or popular as she thought if this was the company she kept. Jenna handled it with a defiance that amazed Owen, shutting down comments with sharp retorts and refusing to be intimidated. But he could see it wearing on her, the way her smiles came less easily, the way she checked over her shoulder more often in the hallways. "You should stop sitting with me," Owen told her one day in the library, the words difficult but necessary. "This is only going to get worse." "Probably," Jenna agreed, "or wild idea, you could actually do something about it instead of just taking whatever they throw at you." Owen stared at her, feeling the familiar spike of shame that came from being seen as weak, as passive, as complicit in his own victimization. "It's not that simple." "It's exactly that simple," Jenna said, her frustration visible. "You let them walk all over you every single day. You think I haven't noticed? You think everyone hasn't noticed? At some point, Owen, you have to stand up for yourself." "You don't understand," he said quietly, thinking about his father, about promises made and the reasons behind them, about the difference between choosing peace and simply being too afraid to choose anything else. "Then explain it to me," Jenna challenged. And when he couldn't find words that would make sense of the complicated knot of obligation and fear and training and restraint that governed his choices, she shook her head and gathered her books and left him sitting alone at the table, feeling her disappointment like a weight on his chest. December pushed toward the winter break, and the school took on that strange quality of impending absence, everyone mentally checking out before physically leaving. The hallways were decorated with paper snowflakes and tinsel. The cafeteria served sad approximations of holiday food. Teachers showed movies instead of teaching new material, and beneath it, all the same dynamics played out with uninterrupted consistency. Tyler's crew maintained their harassment with the steady reliability of professionals, and Owen continued his dual existence of endurance at school and preparation at home, the two worlds running parallel but never quite connecting. In the backyard, he trained through cold that made his breath visible in clouds and turned his fingers numb. He worked on techniques for multiple opponents, for defending against grabs and holds, for maintaining balance when being pushed or pulled. He practiced the mental component too, the visualization of conflict and resolution, the management of adrenaline and fear, the cultivation of clarity his father had emphasized as the foundation of effective action. Real fighting, his father had taught him, happened in the mind first. The body just executed decisions already made at a deeper level. Owen thought about what Jenna had said, about standing up for himself, about the perception of his passivity as choice rather than strategy. Maybe she was right. Maybe the line he'd drawn between restraint and cowardice had become blurred somewhere along the way. Maybe waiting for true necessity was just another way of avoiding responsibility for his own life, for his own dignity, for the basic human requirement of defending what mattered. His father's promise had been about not starting fights, about not using his skills for aggression or ego. But did it really extend to this? To endless abuse, to daily humiliation, to watching someone he cared about become collateral damage in someone else's war on his existence? The last day before winter break arrived, and the school felt like a carnival winding down, everyone counting the hours until freedom. Owen packed his locker carefully, taking home everything he couldn't risk leaving behind, preparing for 2 weeks away from this place and these people. He was almost at his car, almost clear, when Tyler's crew found him in the parking lot. There were 5 of them this time, Tyler and Derek and Brett and Marcus, plus another football player Owen didn't know well, surrounding him with practiced efficiency that suggested planning. The parking lot was emptying quickly, students eager to start their vacation, and the few who remained looked away with that familiar refusal to see or intervene. Tyler held something in his hand, and as Owen's eyes adjusted, he realized it was his backpack, or what remained of it. They'd taken it from his locker somehow, cut it open, and emptied its contents across the asphalt parking lot. His textbooks and notebooks and pens scattered like trash. "Just wanted to make sure you didn't forget us over break," Tyler said, his smile wide and satisfied. "Wouldn't want you getting comfortable or anything." Derek kicked one of Owen's notebooks, sending it skidding across the pavement toward a puddle of dirty slush. "2 weeks is a long time. We'll have to think up something special for when you get back." Owen looked at his scattered belongings, at the destroyed backpack, at the circle of smirking faces around him, and felt something inside him go very still and very cold. Not hot anger that would make him reckless, but cold clarity that made everything sharp and precise. This was it, he realized. This was the line they'd finally crossed, the one that separated endurance from erasure. He could pick up his things and leave, could spend winter break dreading the return to school, could come back in January to whatever special thing they'd planned, could continue this pattern until it broke something fundamental in him. Or he could remember what his father had actually taught him, which wasn't just about technique, but about knowing yourself, about understanding when survival required action rather than patience. But not here. Not now. Not 5 against 1 in a parking lot with no witnesses who would tell the truth. That wasn't courage. That was stupidity, and his father had also taught him the difference between the two. So Owen bent down and began gathering his things, moving methodically while Tyler's crew laughed and made commentary. And when he had everything he could carry, he walked to his car and drove away. But this time, walking away felt different. This time, it felt like a tactical retreat rather than surrender. This time, he was choosing the time and place, not accepting whatever they decided to inflict. The 2 weeks of winter break passed in a kind of suspended tension. Owen spent Christmas with his mother, their celebration quiet and tinged with his father's absence, though a call came through on Christmas morning, with his father's voice crackling over a poor connection, telling them he was safe and thinking of them and proud of them. Owen almost told him about school, about Tyler and the daily degradations, about the decision he could feel crystallizing in his mind. But his mother was there, and his father sounded tired, and some things couldn't be explained over a monitored military phone line. So he said everything was fine, school was good, he was handling things, the familiar lies that protected everyone from truths they couldn't do anything about. In the cold backyard, Owen trained with new purpose. Not preparation anymore, but refinement. He worked through scenarios, thinking about terrain and timing and the psychology of confrontation. He practiced controlling his breathing, managing the adrenaline dump that came with conflict, maintaining clarity under pressure. He reviewed the principles his father had emphasized: minimum necessary force, awareness of consequences, the goal of resolution rather than domination. Real strength, his father had said, was having the power to hurt people and choosing not to. But implicit in that philosophy was the assumption that sometimes you had to demonstrate that power before the choice meant anything. January came, and with it the return to Westbridge High. Owen felt different walking through those front doors. Something settled in his posture, some new quality in the way he moved through space. He wasn't looking for trouble, but he wasn't avoiding it anymore either. He was simply present, aware, ready. The shift was subtle enough that most people didn't notice, but Tyler did. Predators recognized when prey changed categories, even if they didn't immediately understand what that meant. The first week back, Tyler's crew tested the waters with their usual harassment, but something was off. Owen's reactions were different, his body language less defensive, his eye contact more direct. When Derek tried the shoulder check in the hallway, Owen saw it coming and shifted just enough that Derek stumbled and had to catch himself, looking momentarily foolish instead of intimidating. When Marcus accidentally knocked Owen's lunch tray, Owen had already moved it, anticipating the attempt with enough precision that Marcus's hand hit empty air, and the attempt became obvious to everyone watching. "Someone got brave over break," Tyler observed one day in the cafeteria, his voice carrying that particular edge that meant he'd noticed the shift and didn't like it. "Thinking you're tough now, Mitchell?" Owen met his gaze steadily. "I'm thinking I'm done being your entertainment." The cafeteria noise seemed to drop several decibels, students sensing the change in dynamic, even if they didn't fully understand it. Tyler's expression hardened, his easy confidence momentarily disrupted by what might have been surprise or might have been anger. "You're done when I say you're done," he said, standing up from his table, his size and position making the threat implicit. Owen stood too, and the geometry of the confrontation shifted. Tyler was bigger, but Owen's stance was balanced and centered, his hands relaxed at his sides in a way that looked casual but was actually the ready position his father had drilled into him thousands of times. "No," Owen said quietly, his voice calm and absolutely certain. "I'm done now." For a moment, it seemed like Tyler might do something right there in front of teachers and half the school, his pride demanding immediate response to this unprecedented challenge. But he was smarter than that, or at least more calculating. Public confrontation had witnesses, had consequences he couldn't control. Better to wait, to plan, to respond in a way that reasserted dominance without risk. "We'll see," Tyler said finally, sitting back down in a way that tried to make the retreat look like choice rather than hesitation. But everyone had seen it. The moment of uncertainty, the crack in the armor of his confidence. The cafeteria noise resumed, but changed somehow, a new current of speculation running through the usual chaos. Jenna appeared at Owen's table a few minutes later, her expression unreadable. "What was that?" "That was me being done," Owen said simply. "Done how?" Jenna pressed. "Because if you're thinking about fighting them, Owen, that's 5 against 1. That's not brave, that's suicide." "I'm not thinking about fighting them," Owen said, and it was true in the technical sense. He wasn't planning to attack, wasn't seeking confrontation. But he was done avoiding it, done retreating, done accepting whatever they decided to inflict. If they escalated, if they forced the issue, if they left him no option but to defend himself, well, that was their choice, not his. The next few days felt like the air before a thunderstorm, pressure building but nothing breaking yet. Tyler's crew watched Owen differently now, predatory attention that suggested they were planning something, some response that would reassert the natural order and remind everyone of their place. Owen felt their attention like weight, but he didn't let it change his behavior. He walked the hallways with his head up, sat in class without hiding, ate lunch at his usual table without the hunched shoulders that had become habitual. Jenna sat with him every day, and her friends occasionally joined them, expanding his social universe in ways that should have felt good, but instead felt terrifying, because it meant more people in the blast radius when things inevitably exploded. The explosion came on a Friday in late January, after school in the parking lot, a location that had become Tyler's preferred venue for harassment because of its relative lack of supervision. Owen was walking to his car, keys in hand, when he found them waiting. Not just Tyler's usual crew, but 8 people total, football players and hangers-on who'd been recruited for something bigger than usual. They surrounded him in a loose circle, blocking his path to his car, their intention clear in their positioning and their expressions. "Here's how this is going to work," Tyler said, stepping forward as the obvious leader. "You've forgotten your place, Mitchell. Gotten some weird ideas about yourself. So, we're going to remind you how things work around here. You're going to get on your knees and apologize for being disrespectful. You're going to admit that you're nothing, that you're less than nothing, that you're the school punching bag, and you like it that way. And then we're going to take turns recording you saying it, and you're going to thank us for the privilege. And if you don't, well..." He gestured at the circle of people surrounding Owen, the threat implicit in numbers and intent. Owen looked around the circle, calculating distances and positions, identifying the most dangerous fighters and the most likely to hesitate, reading body language and tension levels with eyes trained to see these details. 8 against 1 were poor odds by anyone's calculation, but they weren't arranged optimally. And most of them were clearly there for show rather than genuine commitment to violence. Tyler, Derek, Brett, and Marcus were the real threats. The others would likely back off if things got serious, if actual blood got involved, rather than just the promise of it. "No," Owen said simply, his voice carrying clearly in the cold air. Tyler's expression went through several emotions in quick sequence. Surprise, anger, something that might have been excitement at finally getting real resistance. "What did you say?" "I said no. I'm not getting on my knees. I'm not apologizing. I'm not playing your game anymore." Owen shifted his weight slightly, settling into a more solid stance, his hands still relaxed, but positioned in a way that allowed instant response. "You can let me go to my car, or you can find out what happens when someone finally fights back." For a second, Tyler seemed genuinely taken aback, as if he'd never considered the possibility of real resistance after months of unchallenged dominance. Then his face hardened with the kind of anger that comes from having your authority questioned in front of witnesses. "Brett," he said, not taking his eyes off Owen, "teach him some respect." Brett moved forward, massive and confident in his size, reaching for Owen with hands that had grabbed hundreds of smaller opponents on the football field. But Owen wasn't a static target, and he wasn't waiting to be grabbed. As Brett's hands came forward, Owen moved, a quick sidestep that took him off the line of attack, while his hands came up to redirect Brett's momentum. The technique was called entering, his father had taught him, moving into the space between where your opponent was and where they were going, using their commitment against them. Brett's own force became his enemy, as Owen's grip and twist sent him stumbling past, off balance and confused. Before Brett could recover, Derek came in, faster and meaner, a wild swing aimed at Owen's head. Owen dropped under it, the punch passing through empty air, where his face had been a moment before, and his counter was a precise strike to Derek's solar plexus, not hard enough to cause serious damage, but hard enough to fold him over, gasping for breath. 2 seconds, 2 opponents neutralized, and the circle that had seemed so intimidating suddenly looked uncertain. "What the hell?" Marcus moved next, more cautious than the first two, his hands up in something approximating a boxing stance. They circled each other, and Owen could see Tyler processing this new information, recalculating the situation, realizing that the harmless punching bag knew how to fight, and not just technically, but effectively. Marcus threw a combination, jab cross hook, predictable but fast, and Owen blocked and deflected, his training allowing him to read the sequence before it fully developed. When Marcus overextended on the hook, Owen was inside his guard, an elbow to the ribs and a sweep to the back leg that put Marcus on the ground hard. Now the others were backing away, the hangers-on suddenly remembering they had somewhere else to be, the circle dissolving as people who'd come to watch someone get humiliated decided they didn't actually want to be part of whatever this was. Brett was back on his feet, but hesitating. Derek was still trying to breathe. Marcus was on the ground holding his ribs, and Tyler stood there with an expression that cycled between disbelief and rage. "This isn't over," Tyler said, his voice tight with fury. "You think you're tough? You're dead, Mitchell. You're so dead you don't even know it yet." Owen said nothing, just maintained his position, centered and ready, letting his body language say what words couldn't. Tyler stared at him for a long moment, then turned and walked away, his crew scrambling to follow, leaving Owen alone in the parking lot with his heart hammering and his hands shaking with adrenaline dump, but his mind surprisingly clear. He'd done it. He'd actually done it. He'd stood up, fought back, and won. And nothing in his body felt better or worse than before, but something in his mind felt fundamentally different. But even as the victory registered, Owen knew Tyler had been right about one thing. This wasn't over. Tyler's pride had been damaged in front of witnesses, his dominance challenged successfully, and people like him didn't accept that kind of loss without escalation. Whatever came next would be worse, more planned, more dangerous. Owen had won a battle, but declared a war, and wars had consequences. The weekend passed in strange suspension, Owen's mind replaying the parking lot confrontation over and over, analyzing what he'd done right and what could have gone wrong, preparing for the inevitable next encounter. His mother noticed his distraction and asked if everything was okay, and he told her it was, the lie coming easily after months of practice. On Sunday evening, his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Monday. Behind the school, just you and me, or everyone you care about pays. The message was unsigned, but Owen knew who'd sent it. Monday morning arrived cold and clear, winter sunlight making everything sharp-edged and unforgiving. Owen dressed in layers, partly for warmth and partly because extra clothing could absorb impact, and drove to school with the kind of focused calm that came from accepting inevitable conflict. In first period, he noticed Jenna watching him with concern, and during the break between classes, she cornered him by his locker. "Something's wrong," she said, not asking but stating. "What happened in the parking lot Friday? I heard rumors about you and Tyler's crew." "Just a disagreement," Owen said, closing his locker carefully. "It's handled." "It's clearly not handled." Jenna crossed her arms. "Owen, whatever's going on, you don't have to deal with it alone. There are teachers, there's the principal, there are ways to—" "There are no ways," Owen interrupted gently. "You've seen how that works. They don't want to know, don't want to deal with it, don't want to believe the football star and his friends are capable of what they're capable of. I tried that route. It goes nowhere. So, what are you going to do?" "What I have to," Owen said, and walked away before she could ask more questions that he couldn't answer without making her worry or making her complicit. The school day passed in surreal normalcy, classes proceeding like nothing was different, teachers teaching and students socializing, and the mundane machinery of education grinding forward obliviously. Owen moved through it like a ghost, present but not engaged. His mind already elsewhere, already behind the school where whatever Tyler had planned was waiting. Tyler himself was absent from school, which suggested he was either suspended for the parking lot incident or, more likely, planning whatever he'd summoned Owen to face with enough detail that he needed time to set it up properly. The final bell rang at 3:15, and students flooded into the hallways with the relief that came from another day survived. Owen went to his locker, gathered his things, and then walked deliberately toward the back of the school rather than the parking lot. The rear of Westbridge High was less maintained than the front, the area behind the gymnasium backing onto a tree line that separated school property from the residential neighborhood beyond. There was a loading dock for cafeteria deliveries, a maintenance shed, and a lot of empty space that made it ideal for activities the school didn't officially condone. Tyler was waiting there with his full crew, all 5 of them this time, and they'd brought reinforcements. Owen counted 9 people total, various football players and hangers-on, all bigger than him, all radiating the kind of aggressive confidence that came from numerical superiority. They were positioned deliberately, blocking the obvious exit routes, making it clear this wasn't a conversation he'd walk away from easily. "Glad you could make it," Tyler said, his tone falsely pleasant. "Wasn't sure you'd have the guts to show up." Owen set his backpack down carefully near the maintenance shed, buying himself time to assess the situation. 9-on-1 was beyond poor odds, was basically suicide unless he got incredibly lucky or they got incredibly stupid. But running wasn't an option either, not just because they'd catch him, but because running would mean this continued forever. Would mean looking over his shoulder for the rest of the school year, would mean Tyler had won despite Friday's temporary setback. "Here's what's going to happen," Tyler continued, stepping forward. "You embarrassed me on Friday. Made me look weak in front of people. That can't stand. So you're going to pay for that. And you're going to pay enough that everyone understands what happens when someone disrespects me. Or," Owen said calmly, "you could just let it go. Walk away. We both go our separate ways. Forget this ever happened." Tyler laughed, and his crew joined in, the sound harsh and mirthless. "That's not how this works, Mitchell. That's never how this works. You're the example. You're what happens to people who don't know their place. And today, everyone learns that lesson in a way they won't forget." Owen could see the determination in their faces, the commitment to violence that meant words wouldn't resolve this. He thought about his father, about promises made and principles taught, about the line between defense and aggression, about necessity and choice. This was it, the moment he'd been preparing for, without wanting to admit it, the confrontation that months of endurance had been building toward. 9 against 1, behind the school where no one would intervene, where the outcome would be determined by skill and will, and maybe luck if he was fortunate. "Okay," Owen said, settling into his stance, hands up but relaxed. "Wait."